Welcome to this session of Talking Tech, Women and Girls in ICT. Talking Tech is a series celebrating girls and women in tech. It's been recorded around the world between Girls in ICT 2020 and Girls in ICT Day 2022. Now, Girls in ICT Day is an international day that is marked on the fourth Thursday each April, with the objective to help create a global environment that encourages young women to consider studies and careers in the field of ICT, information and communication technologies. Now, this Talking Tech series is brought to you by ITU, UNICC, and the Office of UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, and is in support of Equals, the Global Partnership for Gender Equality in the Digital Age. My name is Susan Garae, and today I am delighted to be having a discussion about tech and tech careers with Ms. Akriti Bopanna, the Global Policy and Advocacy Manager in Internet Society. So hello again and welcome to this session, Ms. Akriti. And thank you for joining me today. So to kick things off, would you mind introducing a little bit about yourself to our audience and what your current job is?
Hi, everyone. I'm Akriti. As Susan mentioned, I work as the Global Policy and Advocacy Manager at Internet Society. I started working in tech policy around 4 years ago when I joined the Center for Internet and Society in India, which was one of India's first digital rights organization. And I was working there on free speech, on intermediary liability. At the same time, I was at ICANN and I was chairing their cross-community working party on human rights. Since then, I've worked with the Indian government on helping them draft laws and policies. And for the past year and a half, I've been working at the Internet Society. I was heading policy and advocacy for them in India because they realized that a lot of the future of the internet will depend on the regulations and policies that were being drafted in the space in India. So they hired me and a colleague of mine for the first time to do this in India. And this year I'm heading global policy for them because I'm leading a project on digital sovereignty. So that's, I think, the latest issue in technology policy that's of immense global interest.
Wow, this sounds exciting. So you mentioned about being a lawyer and drafting policies. Can you tell us when and how did you get into technology?
Yes, I think actually in my answer, I didn't mention lawyer because I always forget I'm one. I didn't practice very much. I did my undergraduation in business and law, and then I did my master's in international law from the Netherlands in Maastricht. And once I was done with my legal education, which was very interesting, but I was very particular that I didn't want to work in one of the traditional areas that law was practiced in terms of working for a law firm or working for a corporate counsel. I've always enjoyed reading and writing, and I wanted to work in a profession that had a lot more of those components. So I joined a research organization / a think tank called the Center for Internet Society in Bangalore in India, and transitioned, so to speak, from law to policy. A lot of the work that I do, of course, is heavily influenced by the legal environment, in that country or in that space. So it's a lot easier to be a lawyer, I suppose, and do policy. But I predominantly think of myself as a tech policy professional.
That sounds amazing. Okay, so after graduating, do you already by then see yourself as a tech lawyer, or it just occur as you proceed in your career? What was the path from then to now? Like, how do you begin that career and then get into tech? Especially considering there are lawyers and many lawyers, but then having you getting into that.
So, I'd love to have a great answer about how I always had a dream to do this, but I didn't know very much about tech policy. In fact, the year I joined the space, it became a lot more mainstream because the GDPR came up that year, Cambridge Analytica happened that year. So before that, it was a very niche space to work in. And my criteria were two at that point. It was one, I wanted to work in a research organization, and I also wanted to come back to the place that I was living in before I did my master's. So a lot of the reason I'm here today is because of my personal choices as well. And I think they're not so easily differentiated between your professional choices, right? So I joined a research organization that was really good in digital policy. But before I joined it, I had a fair bit of idea what they do and through my interview process, but I didn't know the kind of wonderful work they were doing. So I really just chanced upon this and it worked out over the course of the past 4 years. And I'm really glad because I very much enjoy what I do. But no, I didn't know about tech policy before that. And it definitely was not a dream to join tech policy.
That's really cool. I really admire your career history, especially speaking from this point of view where you address, these digital rights, human rights, and then it's intersecting with internet governance. So what do you like best about your job, especially that you're actually doing now? So what was the favorite part of your job?
Two things. I think firstly, the environment. When you work in civil society, it's very, very collaborative as opposed to a lot of other jobs, I think, which can be a lot more competitive. Civil society is premised upon, sharing your knowledge and working with different stakeholders and engaging with different viewpoints. Ideally, whether it's the kind of work you do in terms of consultations or when you're drafting a policy, you try to remember that not to cater to one kind of stakeholder or one kind of audience or citizen, that it should work for a lot of different, for people across the spectrum. So you're trying to reach that point of commonality. So that's one thing I really enjoy, the fact that I have to be as open-minded as possible. I have to be as broad-minded as possible to ensure that anything that the kind of work I'm doing impacts the most number of people. And the second thing I really enjoy is writing. I mean, I've always enjoyed that since I was a child. I've always enjoyed learning. So I got very lucky that a lot of my career has been, doing research, drafting policy, writing, whether it's papers, blogs, whatsoever. But a lot of it has focused on the written word. And that's something that I really enjoy.
Sounds like you made a great choice right there.
It looks like that on retrospect. Yeah. I mean, when I was starting off, it was such a small space that it was really hard to explain to people what you were doing, because this is probably one of the newest policy fields in public policy, right? So when people think public policy, when I joined, they used to traditionally think economics, health, a lot more of those disciplines, but tech policy was very, very, very on the down low, so to speak. So I think and when I look back, it seems like, what you said, like the career graph and the history seems to make sense, but at every point it wasn't that defined. The choices were very, very based in the moment on what you needed to then or what was working then. And it's just I'm very lucky that it looks like a nice story now. But I think that it's very rare that those your choices end up being a nice story. So I'm very grateful it worked out.
It is. I mean, when you look at the future going forward, what we're seeing is jobs, especially when it comes to jobs that we actually do physically, actually going online. And one of the things that we're seeing here is the future of lawyers, or that is actually changing because of technology. And you being there, like technology wasn't that much of a thing 10 years back. But today you're actually dealing with, technology stuff where we have like social media troubles, all these policies, issues, and et cetera, and et cetera. And you are actually right there on it now. So that is really, really cool. That is really, really cool.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I wouldn't have a job if it weren't for the internet. And I do remember a time before the internet. So it's really cool that this technological development really ended up being, my whole life in a way.
Yes, it is. It is really good. So, looking at your path coming this far, you've also spent time. You've mentioned you spent time also at ICANN. Can you talk a little bit about it, about what you actually did there?
So ICANN is a multi-stakeholder space that deals with domain name management. And when I was working at ICANN, I was representing my organization, and I was one of the few civil societies, along with organizations like Article 19, for example, where we were trying to get a more rights-based perspective in the work that they were doing. So ICANN has a lot of stakeholders. There are technical people, government representatives attend ICANN. There's, of course, industry folks who are there. And I think we at some bit of, at that, it was a post-IANA transition time, which is when ICANN really became multi-stakeholder stakeholder, and we were trying to make sure that all the policies that they were, making for the future were as inclusive, were as accountable, were as transparent as possible. Because a lot of the internet governance mechanisms and policies can tend to be very, very esoteric. Like, you don't know about it as a citizen or as just as a person using the internet. You really have to be involved in the field, or you have to have a lot of specialized opportunities to attend these kind of meetings. So we were trying to make sure that it was as transparent as possible. And definitely, hands down, the biggest achievement for me there was when we ended up formulating a human rights impact assessment. So there was a couple of years of efforts that had gone into it, but the time that I was working, and we managed to formulate one in terms of, so every process that they were looking at, to have a human rights impact assessment and judge whether the policy that you're going to come up with is, how is it going to impact different rights. For example, your rights of appeal, so if a policy is passed and you want to appeal it, but we didn't have a lot of mechanisms for that. Or does it impact your freedom of expression and speech? So we came up with a list of things that we thought was a good rights-based a checklist, and then we implemented it by checking it against a working group parties developments. And eventually I presented it at the Government Advisory Council in Montreal in 2019. And so it kind of became part of the ICANN DNA, but I left ICANN very soon after that because I changed my job. So it was definitely the highlight in a lot of ways of my career, of being able to present that in front of governments and garnered interest to incorporate a much more human rights based perspective in the work that they were doing. And I mean, it's hard because you have to build on that one initiative with consistent effort, but for what it's worth, it was a conversation that happened for the first time. So that was cool.
Wow, that is really cool. Coming to this tech thing, I also realized something about the terminologies that they've be using. Like, did you just enter the tech sector and then all of a sudden you get to blend into what they're actually talking about, or do you have to do your own research to just fill in yourself to find out these different words, what they mean, and especially these tech, terminologies that they've been using?
Yeah, because I think in digital rights, there are two kinds of jargon. One is tech jargon, which is a little less prominent. But I think the second one is internet governance jargon, which is a lot more. But in fact, one of my first tasks when I joined my first office was to go through the ICANN website and all the terms that they had in their glossary. So ICANN does this thing where for certain terms they hyperlink it, so you can see what it means. So one of my first tasks was to go through all the hyperlinks I could see in the stuff that I was reading and just go and understand that. And it takes you years, really, because also one is the jargon and the other is the abbreviations. There are a lot of abbreviations, so it can get tiring to keep asking people what they mean or to remembering that. But I think that was key to me feeling a little less lost in that space, to go through that glossary and make a list of all the abbreviations, at least for the first few meetings. So I wasn't caught off guard when someone said something casually. But no, it's definitely a lot of work that you have to put into to understand the semantics of the space. I mean, I guess every domain has its own jargon, but this can get highly specialized because it's not jargon you hear outside of the space at all. Very rarely would you. So it just takes a bit of time to feel like you fit in, to first learn that language and then to be able to use it yourself.
And seems like you've made a big progress on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so looking back at what you actually been working on apart from ICANN, you're working with Internet Society, and one of the things that you're actually doing is you contribute to the digital rights, right? So one of the questions that I'm asking, I'd like to also get your view on that. Looking at digital rights these days, where there is censorship, there is like chaos when it comes to discussions about encryptions and human rights at itself. Looking at that, at some point, our democracy is being challenged. So my question to you is, what's it like working on that digital right advocacy that you've been working over the past couple of years?
It's really different from each vantage point. So when I was working at my first job, our focus was, I was doing ICANN work, so that was obviously very globally oriented, but there was also a lot of focus on the situation in India itself. There was a lot more politics that you were navigating and that you were trying to mitigate while you were doing that kind of work. It was obviously different when I was working with the government, because that then you're engaging on a completely different platform. But I think where I'm right now is definitely the most fulfilled that I've felt, because I've always been interested in a global outlook, global policy, and at the Internet Society, I get to do that. But also, I mean, the challenge of it, of course, is that digital rights and the idea of progress looks very different from each country, right? So it's not the same as in India that it would be in the US or in Europe. Everybody has a different idea of progress, of development. So you have to find at some level a common denominator uh, to make sure that digital rights conversations and the advocacy that you're doing is relevant to every area. But also at the same time, you have to account for the nuances that come in the different ways. For example, the EU is a lot more forthcoming with digital policy regulations, even something as simple as the GDPR, right? Or we have the Digital Services Act now. So they're a lot more forthcoming than they say US, where there's a lot more freedom and less accountability in a lot of ways for big tech companies. So, my colleagues who do US policy, of course, approach it from a different angle. If I was doing it in India, it's you have to be mindful of the politics of that country. So I think that's some bit of a challenge, but it's also interesting because you're constantly shifting context. So you have to be adapt to be able to think from a universal point of view, but also acclimatize to each country's socio-political environment.
Wow, it looks like it really pays off having lawyers in tech.
I'm not sure if it's
Especially
specific to lawyers, actually. I think a lot of humanities is well versed with thinking from more than one point of view. And in other professions, maybe it's something you learn personally, but not so much professionally. Also, because when you're working in, when you're working in professions that are looking at civic interest or public interest as your main goal, you have to engage with what different versions of that look like. You have to be mindful that you're not pushing your idea of progress or development on one stakeholder, right? Especially, I mean, it's important to me because I come from a country that's very, very heterogeneous. We have huge differences in the strata in our society, and so I know that what I think is good for me and maybe the sort of privileged bubble that I live in is very different from people who don't have access to the internet. So your policies, how much can they be tailored to whom, and how impactful are they to whom? Those are very important questions to remember when you're designing a policy or when you're trying to navigate any of these conversations.
you're really doing a great job there. I mean, when we look at that, even here in Vanuatu, people get into trouble just posting something. People don't know, they don't have this intention to go to jail, but just saying something actually puts them behind bar. And that job here you're actually doing is actually helping advocate for digital rights, which I'm really grateful that you're actually doing that. Having said that, India is also the largest democratic country worldwide. So that could be a good example and a model where other countries could actually model after, especially considering these different chaos and different things happening online, social media, not to mention
Yeah,
lots
I
and
think
lots of problems.
a large part of the chaos is happening in India, if I'm being extremely honest. We're not seeing a model that we think is sustainable or we think is progressive. At some point, we might be retrogressing because every political establishment uses the power of social media, the power of internet, and formulates digital policies according to their agenda, right? So I think one of the biggest learnings for me has been that when I started out, I did belong to the camp of people who thought that technology could be neutral, it could be apolitical, and all the things that the developments that we've seen in the past 4 years. And I think very, very topical right now to talk about the war in between Ukraine and Russia. I mean, how the internet is playing out there, and I think a lot of big tech companies have taken initiatives finally to take a stand, to acknowledge that technology is not neutral, it's political, just as any civic tool will be. So I think that was also one of my biggest learnings, to come to a point where you realize that these tools are very much shaped by the ones that they're used by. So what was before can very, very drastically change, and you have to, I guess, build more accountability within the tools themselves to make sure that they're not misused.
That is very impressive. That is very impressive. So, given your past history, especially in what great job you're actually doing, can you share with us examples, maybe one or two things in which you did, or maybe with tech or in tech platform field, where you think you're particularly proud of, or say, yeah.
So one, I already mentioned the human rights impact assessment that I did at ICANN. That was something that that was very meaningful. The other thing I did was that when I was working with the government in my state in India, we came up with we designed an open data policy for the state. And I think those are the most impactful in a lot of ways, because with global policy work, it's very hard to tell your impact, right? With advocacy, especially, you enjoy the process, you do it, but it's very hard to measure. But I think with work such as the one I was doing with the government, you can see an impact much more clearly. So just by virtue of that, I think it's easier to say what you're proud of, because I really enjoy what I do now, but it's not always the easiest to quantify or measure. So if I had to, measure something that I was proud of, I would say the policies that, you can tangibly see have changed something, that are impacting the future for the better, or that have come up with something that would make citizens' lives easier.
That is really cool. So that brings us to our next question. You mentioned there, things get tough. Some things get hard, like you mentioned global perspective, and then from tailoring policies that will fit, national policies. So along the way you've come, have you encountered any challenges? And if so, how do you overcome them?
A lot of the challenges come from being a woman in the workplace. It's very, I think it's completely different when you're navigating the world as a woman, especially at a workplace. So I think a lot of times that is a challenge to be treated equally, to be treated fairly, to remember that your contributions are as valuable. So I think a lot of that was, a couple of years was spent in feeling like I belonged at the table, that I had something to contribute, and that my voice was worth saying. And it's not that I had to, be. It's not like I had to make sense all the time, but it was okay that I was learning, because this was obviously my first job when I finished my master's. And tech policy can be a very consuming space. There's not always time, at least at that point in time, to teach someone else how the space works. So there was a lot of self-learning, a lot of initiative in figuring out where you fit into this space. So I think a lot of patience, a lot of perseverance in knowing what is working for you, how you can learn something better, and to be able to learn on your own. That's something to learn from your mistakes. I think that's very, very important, because you're probably not always going to have the guidance in fields that are not automatically set up, right? A lot of fields have been around for decades. Tech policy is still settling in. So there's not always going to be a lot of guidance in how you can do well in this space, how you can contribute to this space. So I think, finding your own position within the space can be a challenge as well. And I think definitely, obviously, you get better at writing. I mean, the more you write, the more feedback you get. Depends on also where exactly. When you're writing an academic paper, it's very different from writing a policy. When you're writing a state regulation or a state policy, it's very different from writing a global policy. So I think being open to learning from people and being able to incorporate feedback is really important in making sure that you're always tailoring your policies and you're always relevant, because if you're sticking with one point of view, the world is changing way too fast for policies to be relevant.
Right. That is really true, especially in this digital era. What we're seeing here is innovation keeps happening and disruptions keep happening, but our policies and our laws are still there. We still have to update them so that they match the existing environment of what things are, especially digitally.
Yeah, and also you have to update your mind, right? You can't be, I can't be thinking the same things when I joined this space. I have to be open to knowing, to be, to change my opinion or broaden my mind with the information that's constantly coming. Every year in tech policy has been different. So you have to be open to expanding your mind. You can't enter with the same perspective just because the world is changing much, much too fast.
Very, very good one. So a follow-up question. You mentioned self-learning. So I have a follow-up question on that. I mean, in every careers, there are bad days, there are tough days. So my question to you is, what kept you going? What kept you going? Is this, where do you find inspiration? Do you have a favorite quote that you hold on to during difficult times? Apart from your self-learning skill that you learn yourself during things, especially when you encounter things that are difficult. So what kept you going?
What works for me is the fact that I find inspiration in a lot of things. I love music, I love art, I've always loved reading and literature. I love talking to people who are coming from different perspectives, and I think there are a lot of coping mechanisms and ways to learn that the world already has. They might not be. I don't think it's true, at least for me, that I only learn if I'm reading, say, research papers on a certain subject. I feel like creativity, spontaneity, imagination's honed by everything you're constantly interacting. So if you're open to experiencing a lot of different things, I think it really refines your mind. And to me, balance is very important. So I wouldn't say I'm a workaholic. I love my job and I really enjoy what I do, but it's also important to me that I have I have a time to keep my friendships, my family, things like that. It's very important to me that I have balance in my life, and I've always gravitated towards that. So I think that's something that really keeps me grounded, because at any particular time, there's not one thing that's the sole meaning for me. So in some of the hard times, like you mentioned, when I was struggling at work, the things that got me through are my relationships with my colleagues, my friendships with them, being part of a community together. At different points, it was knowing that I had to give myself some time off and just kind of ride through a motivational lull, or do something else in my personal life to feel better about the things that I was going through in my professional life. So I don't think there's a specific answer. I mean, sometimes it's books, sometimes it's people, sometimes it's music. There's a lot of comfort to be found in different things, and I think I've always been lucky that I enjoy them all. So whenever it's hard, I just turn to either one of them exclusively, or I'm doing a little bit of everything. But I think at the end of the day, I have a lot of gratitude for what I have, and I always remember that no matter what's happening in my professional life, there's a lot more that's important. So everything will be fine, because there's a lot more to your life than your job.
Very positive, very positive. So coming this far, looking back on how far you've came, what's a lesson that you've learned along that way, along that journey, that you would like to share with our audience? If there's one lesson that you think you would want to share, what would that be?
The fact that, first, I think that there's a lot of pressure on people to figure out their career right when they're starting it out. So I think the first thing that I would say is that that's not how it always works out. And I think it can be really enriching to not have your life planned out. It can be very enriching to learn from what you're doing in that current space and see what you want to do next, as opposed to entering it from a very rigid idea of what that roadmap should look like, or what everything, when and where everything should fit in. So I think that's the first thing that I would say. I mean, that works for me, at least. I don't have a 5-year plan or 10-year plan. I'm learning in the moment, and maybe tomorrow I don't want to do policy anymore, and I want to explore different interests, or maybe I'm going to be in policy forever. I have no idea, and genuinely I have no opinion, because I enjoy what I do now, but I'm not sure if that's something that's I want to devote all of my my working life to. So that's the first thing. I think not having a very preconceived notion has helped me. And secondly, I think um, in a lot of ways, learning from the people around you, from having those kind of collaborative relationships with your colleagues or with your boss. But for whatever said and done, and as competitive, as the world can be, I think, especially in our jobs, it's even more important to have a supportive environment. So it's always nice when you're learning and you're collaborating with whether it's other stakeholders or whether it's your other team members. But to know that, especially when you're starting out in your career, it's very nice to have people who are all starting out at the same time. A lot of the people that I turn to today are people who all of us didn't know what we were doing 4 years ago, but we figured it out, and we felt better about figuring it out because we had that kind of a collaborative friendship environment. So to also remember that as much as your job is about you, but you're also a cog in a wheel. Like, there's an ecosystem where you fit in, and if you're trying to help an ecosystem and not just boost your own place in that, then it really enriches everyone around and it expands the space that you're working in. So I think that's important as well. But like I said, I come from civil society, so I'm I approach this very differently, because to me, that's the way we learn. Like, it's easier to have a level playing field. We're all learning at the same time than you being, say, the smartest person in the room.
I would agree on that. I agree on that. I mean, and not everyone knows everything, but someone is good on something more than you. So
Yeah.
that's where collaboration comes in and can be a very powerful and equipping thing for anyone.
Yeah. For example, even in tech policy, like, I don't come from a technical background, right? But I have enough support of friends who do. So when I'm leaning to something I don't understand, I know I can lean towards them, and I don't have to be an expert in that. But we can have that transfer of knowledge, or we can teach each other, and it makes everyone better for it.
Exactly. That is really inspiring. So since this series is about girls and women in tech, do you have any career and tech advice for young women and girls in tech?
It's important to drown out the noise. I think that's the most important thing I've learned as a woman in this field, that as soon as you're born, there are a lot of ideas, there are a lot of expectations of what women should do, what our place in society is, what our place in the professional workplace is, what are the qualities, for example, that we should bring, and there are a lot of rules for that. And I think at some level, to succeed, you have to um, firstly have and some level of self-awareness, but you also have to have the ability to drown out the noise and focus on what you're doing, and not always pander to what you think the expectations are, because there's just too many. And I think at the end of the day, you have to figure out which ones work for you and what don't. But the ability to say no, for example, I think the best thing women can learn is how to say no. How to say no, because I think that really, as a woman, is more useful than the ability to say yes. So I think that's one thing that we should, and we all don't come from backgrounds, especially personally, where we've been taught that, right? We've been taught to be kind and nice and please people and make everyone happy, and it gets harder when you're in the workplace, because there are a lot of dynamics playing out. So I think the ability to say no, to drown out noise, but at the same time also you have to know who you respect, so you take feedback from. I think there's some line in between where you're open to being taught better, but knowing that those are in the fields you're working in or the work you're doing, but not broadly just what the expectation of you to fit in are. Yeah.
That is really true. I mean, we women, many of us find it hard to say no. It's like we need to have a course on that so people can get used to saying no. But at the end of the day, it
And not
does
feel
help.
guilty about it also. Actually, it's not just saying no, right? It's also saying no and then not feeling guilty about it and trying to overcompensate in some ways. I mean, that's a whole master's in itself. I think, it takes us way too long to learn that. You're like post 25 when you learn that, I think. And I think it would be much useful if you learned that much, much early on. Your career could look very different.
Yep, like you said, you cannot please everyone. So use
Yeah.
that word, no.
And I think being a feminist helps with that. It helped me a lot with, and I'm not talking about always, it's not about always reading, theory or ideological. Of course, you have to know where the movement stems from or where the ideology is rooted in. But to me, being a feminist was really important because, especially the kind of work we do, you can't do inclusive work, you can't do accessibility work, you can't do rights-based work if you don't have a feminist perspective. Then your work is in this space will always be lacking because you're not thinking holistically. So I think, to me, definitely having that feminist perspective and approaching my life and work with those kind of values as a North Star was very, very useful.
That is really, really cool. So I think we've completed all the questions I've prepared for you.
That's great. Thank you so much. This was really nice, and thank you so much for taking out the time to do this.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you so much for joining today. So before you go, I'd like to say thank you, and also your end remarks would wrap up our session here.
Yeah.
Yes, it's very true. I agree with you. Women need to say no at times because it will help shape them, help them find their path rather than following just about anything someone said. That is really, really important. And also going back on what you said, it's okay to do self-learning. I mean, when it comes to tech, I think many women shy away from that because they can see that there are lots of hard stuff to be learning, but then as they forgot that you can actually do it. You could actually teach yourself.
You can try, yeah. And I think it's important to try because even if you don't get a grasp of it, knowing that you've tried, I think helps a lot. It helps to know what you don't know as well, right? So
yes, summing it up, we ladies, we need at some point in our lives, we need to be comfortable taking risk like you do. You really take risk on that and self-teach yourself when things get tough. This is really, really cool. And I think one of the things that we are lacking today, and one of the things that less women are joining ICT is because they are not comfortable taking that risk and see how far they could actually go. And I think this makes fear robbing them of the potential success that should have happened, because fear comes in and then it just makes them not trying. So that is a really, really good one. So like you said, we'd like to also encourage all girls out there to pick up ICT career paths today. People like yourself, lawyers, could also find their path also in ICT. And I believe ICT is a place where every woman could actually have a space there, have something that they could actually do. I mean, not every ladies should be scared of, programming, but programming is not the only thing that exists in the ICT field. There are lots and lots of different jobs a lady could actually be doing. So that's something that it's really inspiring to see that we could actually join and also integrate physical activities, physical jobs with the digital stuff and going forward, especially going forward now where things are becoming more digital than they were, and the basic jobs that we have as ladies in the past slowly going automated. And if women do not take up or consider taking ICT courses or career, then 10 years from now, 5 years from now, their jobs will be automated. Traditional jobs are going automated, and then that will only increase the gap between women in workforce. And that is something I think many of us do not like. So thank you again, Ms. Akriti. I really appreciate your wisdom here and sharing your experience with us. I believe it shows our audience that no matter what type of profession you are, you could actually make it to the tech world. You can actually be part of ICT. you don't have to actually come from an ICT background or IT. You could be a lawyer, but then integrate that into tech, and that is really, really cool. So my last words to everyone and the audience listening, and we'll be listening on that. Ladies, pick up a ICT career today, or get your studies in ICT, because as far as we're going, what we're seeing is the pandemic is challenging all traditional jobs. But what we're seeing is ICT is going stronger and stronger and stronger. And even in the midst of the pandemic, it's ICT that holds us together. It's ICT that kept us going. So for a job that will be guaranteed 25 years from now, pick an ICT job, pick an ICT course. So with that remarks, my name is Susan, and we thank you for your time with us today.